The wind carried dust and dread through the small frontier town that morning, the kind of dry wind that stung the eyes and whispered of something coming. Folks along the main street had already heard the news, whispers that an Apache band had raided the cattle trail north of the river. But this was no ordinary raid. They hadn't come for gold, food, or horses. They had taken one woman, an old widow who'd spent her whole life tending to a tiny cabin at the edge of town. Some said she was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. Others believed the raiders were sending a message, but no one could explain what kind of message would justify taking the mother of the quietest boy in town. The boy hadn't spoken much since his father died 2 winters ago. Folks remembered him sitting near the well, carving small wooden figures of horses and birds, never saying a word, just staring at the horizon as if waiting for something. Or someone. He was strange, people said. Not cruel or wild like some, just quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that made folks uneasy when they noticed his eyes. Deep, dark, and always watching. His mother used to say he carried 2 souls inside him, one born of her, and one born of the desert itself. Nobody knew exactly what that meant, but everyone remembered her saying it, and now she was gone. The town's men gathered in front of the sheriff's office the day she was taken. A few wanted to ride out immediately, track the Apache through the canyon and bring her back, but most weren't so sure. The desert wasn't kind to fools or heroes. The Apache land stretched for miles beyond the Red Rock Ridge, and once a person crossed that line, they were no longer in the hands of God, but in the hands of fate. The sheriff said they'd send word to the fort and wait for soldiers, but by then she'd likely be dead or worse. And through it all, the boy just stood there, barefoot in the dust, staring at the direction the raiders had gone. That night, a strange silence fell over the town. No one played music at the saloon. No one lit lamps past dusk. Even the dogs seemed to sense something heavy in the air. The boy's cabin stood empty except for the faint smell of smoke from the fireplace his mother used to keep burning through the cold nights. A neighbor tried to bring him food, but he was nowhere to be found. They searched the barns, the riverbed, even the hills where he liked to wander. Nothing. It was as if the desert had swallowed him whole. 2 days passed. On the 3rd morning, just as the sun climbed over the ridgeline, a cloud of dust rose from the south. At first, folks thought it was a storm, one of those swirling sand clouds that sometimes rolled across the plains before noon. But then they heard the sound, hooves, hundreds of them. The ground trembled. The glass windows of the general store rattled. Children ran into their homes. Mothers pulled curtains tight and men grabbed their rifles and peered from behind fences. Out from the shimmering heat came riders, an army of them. They rode in perfect rhythm, their faces painted, their feathers glinting under the sun. At the head of them rode the boy. He wasn't wearing his tattered old clothes anymore. His hair, once uneven and cut by his mother's trembling hands, now hung long and braided, tied with leather cords. His face was marked with lines of white paint that ran down his cheeks, and around his neck hung an Apache warrior's pendant. But it was his eyes, those same quiet, watching eyes that froze everyone in place. They were calm but not empty. They carried the weight of something the rest of them couldn't understand. The riders came to a stop at the edge of town. 1,000 warriors, their horses snorting, their spears lifted high. The dust settled slow around them, like a curtain being drawn. The boy dismounted, his boots touching the dirt with a sound that seemed louder than the thunder of hooves that had brought him there. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. The people could feel the message in the air, sharp and cold as the edge of a blade. The sheriff stepped forward, his hand hovering near his revolver. "Where's your mother, boy?" he asked, his voice trying to hold steady. The boy looked at him, then turned his eyes toward the north ridge. Somewhere beyond those rocks, past the dry river and the dead pines, lay the camp of the men who had taken her. "She's still alive," someone whispered. Nobody knew how they knew. Maybe it was the way he stood. Maybe it was something in his silence. Whatever it was, it made grown men step back without even realizing it. The boy motioned with his hand, and one of the Apache warriors rode forward, dropping something into the dust at the sheriff's feet. It was a single silver hairpin, the kind his mother always wore. The sheriff bent down, picked it up, and looked at the boy again. "You're gonna start a war if you ride out there," he said. The boy's eyes didn't move. He didn't blink. His small hand rested on the worn handle of a knife at his belt. Behind him, the warriors let out a single low cry, a sound that rolled through the valley like thunder trapped inside a canyon. Horses shifted. The air turned heavy. No one in town knew how the boy had done it, how he had found them, convinced them, or what he had promised. Some said his mother was once kind to an Apache family long ago, and they owed her a debt. Others said the boy wasn't entirely one of them, that his blood carried something wild and old. The truth was buried somewhere between the whisper of wind and the beat of hooves. By noon, the boy and the warriors were gone again, riding north toward the Red Ridge. Dust swallowed their trail until it was like they'd never been there. Only the hairpin remained, lying in the dirt, glinting faintly in the sunlight. That night, thunder rolled over the desert, though no storm followed. Fires burned far beyond the ridge, faint flickers on the horizon. The people of the town stood on their porches watching, wondering if it was the Apache or the soldiers or something else entirely. Nobody slept. The sheriff sat alone outside his office, the silver hairpin on his desk, turning it over and over between his fingers. Somewhere beyond that horizon, a mother was praying for her son to find her. And somewhere closer, her son was no longer the quiet boy who once carved birds by the well. He was something else now, something the desert itself seemed to have woken. The next morning, the wind shifted again. It carried the smell of smoke and something else, iron, ash, and sorrow. The mountains echoed faint sounds that might have been gunfire, or might have been something older, something the desert had heard too many times before. No one dared to leave the town that day. The silence was heavy, unnatural. Even the church bell refused to ring. The townsfolk waited, counting the hours, watching the ridge, half expecting to see riders returning. And as the sun began to set, the horizon glowed red once more. From that light, a single figure appeared, walking alone, barefoot, his clothes torn, his face streaked with dust and war paint. It was the boy. Behind him, far in the distance, the sound of horses began again, hooves like rolling thunder, voices like wind howling through the canyons. Whether they were coming to finish what he had started or to deliver something else entirely, no one knew. But one thing was certain: the quiet boy had changed everything. And by nightfall, the desert would remember his name. He came back just as the sun dropped low, carrying the same silence that had always followed him, though now it felt heavier, darker, as if the desert itself had changed him. His small frame was still there, but his steps carried a strange steadiness, a quiet command that didn't belong to a boy anymore. Folks who saw him said his eyes looked older, like he had seen something no child should ever see. His clothes were torn, his hands streaked with ash and blood. Not fresh but old, dried by the desert wind. He didn't speak. He didn't even look around as he walked straight through the center of town, heading toward his mother's cabin. The people followed at a distance, whispering among themselves. No one dared to stop him. Some thought the Apache warriors had sent him back as a warning. Others believed he had led them to something far worse. The sheriff called out once, but the boy didn't turn. He pushed open the creaking cabin door and stepped inside. The firewood by the hearth was still stacked neatly where his mother had left it, and her shawl hung over the chair. The boy stood in the doorway for a long time, as if expecting to hear her voice call his name. But there was only the wind. Later that night, lanterns flickered across town as the sheriff gathered a few men to speak. The saloon was nearly empty, save for the uneasy faces huddled around one table. The barkeep poured whiskey, his hands trembling. The sheriff placed the silver hairpin on the table and looked at the men. "He's back," he said quietly. "But his mother isn't, and I reckon something's coming." One of the ranchers leaned forward. "You mean the Apache?" The sheriff nodded. 1,000 of them rode through here without touching a thing. That wasn't an attack, that was a warning. And if that boy's standing here alive, it means he's not done yet. Outside, the night stretched long and restless. Coyotes howled in the distance. The moonlight shimmered on the roofs, painting everything silver and pale. At the edge of town in that small cabin, the boy sat beside the dead fire, staring at the wall. He held his mother's shawl in his hands, pressing it to his face. Every sound outside, the crack of wood, the wind against the door, made his shoulders tense, as if his body remembered fear even when his eyes did not. He hadn't eaten since he returned. He barely slept. Some said he was waiting. Others said he was listening. But for what? No one could guess. The old widow who lived across the creek claimed she saw shadows in the hills that night, dark figures watching from the ridge. She swore they were Apaches, but no one else saw them. Still, the next morning, every man in town cleaned his rifle and checked his horse just in case. The blacksmith was the first to approach the boy again. He had known the family for years and had always kept a quiet respect for them. He found the boy near the barn, fixing a broken wagon wheel like he'd done it 100 times before. "You all right, son?" he asked gently. The boy didn't answer. The man crouched beside him. You want to tell me what happened out there? The boy finally looked up. His voice when it came was soft and hollow. They took her north, he said. Past the ridge. There's a camp beyond the canyon. The blacksmith frowned. You saw her? The boy nodded slowly. She was alive when I left. Left? The man's brow furrowed. You mean they let you go? The boy didn't reply. He stood, dusted off his hands, and walked away. There was something in his expression, neither sorrow nor anger, but a quiet certainty, the kind that made grown men uneasy. Days passed, and the tension in town grew thicker. The fort sent a rider to warn them that an Apache warband had been seen near the mountains, but no one could tell if it was the same one that had followed the boy. Cattle disappeared from nearby ranches. A wagon train heading west vanished along the trail, leaving behind only torn canvas and hoofprints. The air smelled of smoke each morning, faint but always there, like a reminder that fire wasn't far. The boy spent most of his time on the ridge, sitting alone where the desert stretched endless before him. Sometimes he'd carve wooden figures again, horses, birds, faces with hollow eyes. He buried some in the sand, as if leaving markers for something unseen. Children from the town would sneak up to watch him, but ran when he turned his head. They said he spoke in another tongue when he thought no one was listening. One evening, as the sun burned red across the sky, the sheriff rode up to meet him. You got folks scared, son, he said, pulling his horse to a stop. They think you brought trouble here. The boy didn't move. I didn't bring it, he said. It was already coming. The sheriff studied him. You said your mother's alive. If that's true, we can send men to bring her home. But you gotta tell me where. The boy looked out over the horizon, where the canyons glowed faintly in the dying light. You can't go there, he said. It's not your place. And whose place is it? He turned then, eyes hard and distant. The ones who still remember what was taken from them. The sheriff didn't know what to say. He had seen war before, had seen men break and bend under it, but this was something different. The boy wasn't speaking like a child anymore. He was speaking like someone who had already chosen a side. That night, fires lit up the distant hills again. The townsfolk gathered on porches, watching in silence. The glow seemed to move, shifting across the landscape like spirits dancing through the dark. Horses in the stables grew restless, and dogs barked toward the ridge until dawn. No one slept. By morning, smoke curled low over the horizon. The boy was gone again. His footprints led north. The sheriff gathered a small group to follow, but turned back halfway when they found the bodies of 3 men near the riverbank. Scouts, dressed in army coats, their rifles still loaded. Whatever had happened, it wasn't a simple raid. Back in town, people began to leave. Wagons rolled out toward the east road, carrying families who didn't want to wait for whatever was coming. Those who stayed behind kept their shutters closed and their guns close. The blacksmith tried to hold on to hope, but even he began to lose faith when the well dried up that week. The desert was tightening its grip, and everything in it felt cursed by silence. Meanwhile, far beyond the ridge, word spread through the Apache camps that a child had returned, a child who spoke with both the tongue of the white man and the voice of the earth. Some said he was chosen by the spirits. Others said he carried vengeance in his blood. But all agreed that where he walked, the old ways would rise again. In town, nobody knew any of this. They only knew the boy's shadow lingered over every conversation, every restless night. The sheriff stopped ringing the church bell on Sundays, saying it drew too much attention. The saloon doors stayed shut. Even the wind seemed to whisper differently now, carrying voices that didn't belong to the living. And then one night, just before the moon rose, a rider came tearing into town, his horse foaming at the mouth. He stumbled into the street, shouting for the sheriff. His face was pale, his shirt torn and stained. "They're coming," he gasped. "They're all coming." The sheriff helped him to the ground. "Who's coming?" The man's voice shook. The Apaches. Hundreds of them. They're riding through the canyon, men, women, all of them. And that boy, he's leading them. A silence spread through the gathered crowd. The sound of crickets died. Someone dropped a lantern and the glass shattered like a gunshot. The sheriff didn't speak. He just looked north, past the edge of the town, toward the dark ridges where the fires had burned. Deep down, he knew this wasn't just another raid. This was something else, a reckoning that had been years in the making. By dawn, the first dust clouds appeared on the horizon again. Horses. Many of them. The ground began to tremble once more, just as it had before. And standing on the ridge, in the golden light of morning, was the boy, barefoot, unflinching, his mother's shawl tied around his shoulder. Behind him stretched an army. They moved like the wind, unstoppable and silent. No one in town breathed. The sheriff's hand hovered near his gun, but even he knew bullets couldn't stop what was coming. The boy raised his hand, and the riders halted as one. The desert fell silent. Even the wind stopped moving. Then slowly the boy began to walk forward. No one yet knew whether he had come to destroy or to deliver mercy. But every heart in that town knew one thing for certain. The boy who once carved birds by the well was gone. In his place stood something far older, far more dangerous, and the desert itself seemed to hold its breath for what he would do next. The boy stood on the ridge, his figure small against the rising sun, yet no one watching him felt he was small anymore. The silence that hung over the town felt alive, like the air itself waited to see what he would do. Behind him, the 1,000 Apache warriors stood motionless, their horses shifting restlessly, their weapons catching faint glints of light. Every man, woman, and child in the town below felt the same quiet dread, the kind that makes your heartbeat sound louder than thunder. The sheriff stepped forward, his boots crunching on the dry earth. He could feel eyes on him, from the townsfolk behind and from the warriors above. His hand hovered over his holster, but he knew pulling a gun now would be the same as digging his own grave. He raised his voice just enough to carry. "If you've come for blood," he called, "you won't find what you're looking for here." The boy's eyes stayed fixed on him, unblinking, calm. His voice came low, almost lost in the wind. "They took her. You all watched." The words struck the sheriff harder than a bullet, because they were true. No one had helped. No one had even tried. The town had stood by and let a widow be dragged from her home because they were afraid. Afraid of the Apaches. Afraid of dying. Afraid of the truth that courage costs more than anyone wants to pay. One of the warriors behind the boy rode forward, older, broader, with a face carved by wind and war. He spoke in a deep voice, his language rough like gravel, and though the sheriff didn't understand every word, he caught enough to know the meaning. Justice, mother, promise, fire. The boy translated softly. "They gave me their word. They will not harm your people if you tell the truth." The sheriff swallowed hard. The truth about what? The boy stepped closer, and for the first time the sheriff saw the knife at his belt, the same kind his mother used for cutting bread. The men who took her, he said, weren't Apaches. A murmur ran through the townsfolk. The sheriff's jaw tightened. "That's not possible. We saw the tracks. They made the tracks," the boy interrupted quietly. "They painted their faces, stole horses, and burned their own trail. They wanted you to blame the Apaches so you wouldn't look at them." The sheriff felt the blood drain from his face. "Who?" The boy looked past him toward the saloon, where the owner and a few ranchers stood on the porch pretending not to listen. "The ones who sell land that doesn't belong to them," he said. "The ones who dig gold from the ground that feeds no one. The ones who made deals with soldiers who never cared if a woman lived or died." The sheriff turned to follow his gaze, and for the first time, noticed how the saloon owner's hand shook as he raised a cigarette to his lips. That was when the first shot cracked. It came from the roof of the feed store, echoing across the town. The bullet missed the boy by inches, hitting the dirt near his feet. The warriors roared, their horses rearing. The sheriff dropped to the ground as arrows flew, slicing through the air like lightning. Dust exploded. The sound of chaos swallowed the morning. The warriors didn't charge. They waited for the boy's signal. And that was the most terrifying thing of all. It meant they were disciplined, united, and willing to hold their fire until he decided otherwise. When the smoke cleared, 2 men lay dead in the street. Both had rifles, both from town. The saloon owner was gone, his back door swinging open, a trail of footprints leading toward the hills. The sheriff climbed to his feet, coughing through the dust. "This wasn't supposed to happen," he said hoarsely. The boy looked at him coldly. "It already happened. You just didn't see it." That day the warriors set camp outside of town. They didn't attack. They didn't move. They just waited, forming a silent wall between the ridge and the desert beyond. The townsfolk didn't know whether to run or pray. Every door was barred, every gun loaded. By nightfall the desert was painted orange by 100 fires. The boy sat at one of them, staring into the flames, silent as ever. The old Apache chief sat beside him, speaking softly. "You can still choose peace," the old man said. The boy's jaw tightened. "Peace doesn't bring her back. War won't either." The boy looked up, his eyes reflecting the firelight. "Then maybe it'll stop them from taking someone else's mother. The old man nodded slowly. Then you must decide who you really fight for, the living or the dead. Meanwhile, back in town, the sheriff found himself standing in the church alone. The pews were empty. The candlelight flickered weakly against the cracked walls. He bowed his head, not to pray but to think. He had been a lawman long enough to know that guilt has its own scent. It follows a man even when he hides behind badges or business. And now that scent was all over his town. He thought about the saloon owner and the ranchers, men who had been too eager to buy land from the government after the Apaches were forced out. Men who knew exactly where the silver veins ran beneath the hills. Men who would do anything to keep their secrets buried. As he left the church, he saw a figure waiting outside. Lydia, the widow from across the creek. Her eyes were wide with fear. "Sheriff," she whispered, "you have to see this." She led him behind the general store down to the edge of the creek. There, half buried in mud, was a torn piece of fabric, a woman's shawl. It was the same pattern as the one the boy had tied across his shoulder. The sheriff crouched, touching the cloth. It was damp but not old. "She's alive," Lydia said. Or was, not long ago. He looked toward the ridge where the Apache fires burned in the distance. "If that's true," he muttered, "then this whole thing is just beginning." The next day, the town woke to find the boy gone again. His tracks led toward the mountains. The warriors still stood watch, but now they seemed restless. The sheriff saddled his horse before sunrise, telling no one where he was going. As he rode through the canyon, he found the signs of struggle, spent shells, broken arrows, blood on the rocks. And then far ahead, a small campfire. He dismounted quietly and crept closer. The boy sat beside the fire, sharpening his knife, and across from him, tied and bruised, was the saloon owner. The sheriff stepped out into the open. "You don't have to do this," he said. The boy didn't look up. "He took her," he said softly. "He sold her to the soldiers at the fort." The saloon owner shook his head weakly. "That's a lie." I just stopped," the boy said, and the man fell silent. His voice wasn't angry. It was empty, the kind of tone that makes truth sound heavier than judgment. The sheriff took a step closer. "If you kill him, they'll all come for you, the army, the settlers, everyone. You'll start a war this territory won't survive." The boy finally raised his eyes. "It already started, Sheriff. You just didn't hear it." A long silence hung between them, broken only by the crackling fire. Somewhere far off, a hawk cried. The sheriff saw something shift in the boy's face then, something human flickering behind the cold. For a moment he thought the boy might listen, but then the ground began to shake again. The sound of hooves echoed through the canyon, growing louder with every heartbeat. The warriors were coming, their voices rising in haunting chants. The sheriff looked toward the ridge and his chest went cold. They weren't coming for blood. They were coming for truth. The boy stood gripping the knife, his mother's shawl fluttering in the wind. The saloon owner began to weep. The sheriff drew a slow breath, realizing he was standing at the edge of something that could no longer be stopped. The boy turned toward him, his voice low, certain. "When the fire starts," he said, "don't put it out. Let it show them what they did." And as the riders appeared on the horizon, their silhouettes dark against the burning sky, the sheriff knew the desert would never forget this day. The line between justice and revenge had vanished, and the quiet boy who once carved birds by the well had become the storm everyone feared. The canyon wind howled like a living thing that morning, dragging dust through the rocks and carrying the faint echo of hooves from miles away. The sheriff stood motionless, his hand hovering above his revolver, though he knew no weapon could change what was coming. Across the fire, the boy's face flickered in the orange light, unreadable, distant. Behind him, the canyon walls glowed red beneath the first stretch of dawn, and the shadows of the Apache riders appeared one by one, black shapes against burning sky. The saloon owner was on his knees, hands bound, mumbling half prayers and half apologies to no one in particular. His voice trembled with the desperation of a man who had lived too long by his own deceit. "I didn't mean for her to die," he said. "I swear it wasn't supposed to go that far." But the boy said nothing. He only stared, like he was waiting for the truth to burn itself out of the man's throat. The sheriff stepped forward slowly. "You're gonna tell me everything," he said to the saloon owner. "Every deal, every lie, every person you sold to those soldiers." The man's lips quivered. "They came with gold," he whispered. "Said they wanted workers, just workers. I didn't know." The boy's knife flashed in the firelight. "You knew," he said softly. "You watched." The sheriff felt his heart tighten. "Enough," he said firmly, his voice low but steady. Let him speak. We need to know where she is. The boy didn't lower the knife, but his gaze softened slightly, almost unwillingly. The man swallowed hard and began to speak, his words spilling out like a confession torn from his chest. They took her to the fort near Dry River. Said she'd be safe there, said the officers needed someone to cook, to clean. His voice broke. But when the raid started, they turned on everyone. I heard they moved the prisoners north. I tried to stop it, I swear, but the boy cut him off. You didn't try, he said coldly. You ran. The man shook his head violently. Please, I didn't mean. Before he could finish, the ground began to tremble. The sheriff turned toward the canyon mouth where the sound of hooves rolled closer. Dust rose in thick waves and a deep cry rang out, a war call that seemed to shake the very stones. The Apache army had arrived, and at their center rode the old chief, his spear raised high, his expression grim. The sheriff stepped back, shielding his eyes from the dust. He could see the fear twisting the saloon owner's face, but it was the boy's silence that frightened him more. It was the kind of silence that made men break before a word was ever spoken. The chief dismounted, walking slowly toward the fire. His eyes fell on the prisoner, then the boy, then finally the sheriff. The blood debt must end, he said in his rough, heavy tone. But not before truth is seen. The sheriff nodded slowly. Then let's find it. The old man turned to the boy. You lead us to this fort. If she is there, we will bring her home. But if she is gone, his voice faded into the wind. The boy's jaw tightened. Then the land will remember. By midday, the army began its march. The boy rode at the front, the sheriff beside him, though neither spoke. The canyon narrowed, walls pressing closer, and the air grew thick with heat and dust. Every echo of a hoofbeat felt like thunder waiting to break. Somewhere behind them, the saloon owner rode bound to a horse guarded by two warriors. His cries for mercy had long since gone quiet. When they reached the open plains, they could see the fort in the distance, a low stretch of wood and stone surrounded by barbed wire and smoke. The flags on the towers barely moved in the heat. It looked deserted, but the boy could feel eyes watching. The old chief gave a sharp whistle, and the riders fanned out, forming a wide circle around the hill. The boy dismounted, crouched low, and pressed his hand to the ground. He closed his eyes, listening to the vibrations beneath the earth, the way the Apache trackers had taught him. When he looked up, his voice was certain. There are soldiers, he said. 20, maybe more. And something else. The sheriff frowned. What else? The boy's eyes flicked toward the smoke. Fear, he said quietly. The kind that comes before dying. They waited until sunset. The warriors moved silently through the dry brush, closing in on the fort like ghosts. The boy led them through. A narrow trench that had once been a drainage ditch, now cracked and dry. Every creak of leather, every clink of metal sounded too loud. When they reached the outer wall, the boy signaled for stillness. The world seemed to hold its breath. Then, from inside the fort, a single voice cried out. A woman's voice, faint but unmistakable. The sheriff felt the air catch in his chest. The boy's eyes widened, and for the first time in days, something human broke through his calm. It's her, he whispered. Before anyone could stop him, he climbed the wall in silence, moving with the swiftness of someone who had been born to the land. The sheriff cursed under his breath and followed, his boots scraping against the wood. When they reached the top, the sight below made both men freeze. The fort wasn't abandoned. It was a prison. Dozens of wooden cages filled the yard, each holding people, some settlers, some Apache, all ragged and thin. The soldiers inside were fewer than expected, maybe a handful, but their faces were hollow, their eyes wild. Whatever command they once had was gone. They were men left behind, desperate and broken, and among the prisoners, near the center cage, sat the boy's mother. Her hair was streaked with gray, her hands bound, but when she lifted her head, her eyes were still sharp. The boy almost leapt down, but the sheriff grabbed his arm. Wait, he whispered. If they see you now, they'll shoot. The boy's breath came fast, his muscles tense. She's there, he hissed. I can't. A shout cut him off. One of the soldiers had spotted them. Gunfire erupted, bullets splintering wood around them. The boy dove to the ground as the warriors outside returned fire, arrows slicing through the dusk. Smoke filled the air, and the sharp smell of gunpowder stung the nose. The sheriff pulled the boy behind a broken cart. You wanted the truth, son? Here it is, it's chaos. You'll get her killed if you rush in. The boy's eyes burned. Then tell me what I'm supposed to do. Wait again? The sheriff didn't answer. He peeked through a gap in the wall and saw the soldiers retreating toward the main building, dragging a few prisoners with them. The boy's mother was among them. The Apache war cry rose again, echoing off the canyon walls. The warriors poured through the outer gates, and the battle exploded like thunder. Arrows met bullets, horses reared, men shouted. Fire leapt from one corner of the fort, spreading fast through the dry timbers. The sheriff drew his revolver, firing at the soldiers who tried to flee. He couldn't tell any more who was winning, only that the ground shook with the weight of everything breaking loose. The boy slipped through the chaos, ducking under fences, weaving between fires until he reached the main building. He kicked the door open, the hinges snapping under the force. Inside, the air was thick with smoke. He could hear coughing, footsteps, and his mother's faint voice. "Son," she called weakly. He followed the sound, cutting through a line of smoke and flame until he saw her chained near the wall. Her face lit up when she saw him. "You came," she whispered. He dropped to his knees beside her, fumbling with the locks. "I promised I would." Outside, the noise grew louder, the sound of war reaching its fever pitch. The sheriff burst in moments later, coughing hard. "We gotta move," he shouted. "The fire's spreading." The boy broke the last chain, pulling his mother to her feet. Together they stumbled toward the door, but as they stepped outside, a gunshot cracked the air. The saloon owner, half dead and bloodied, had broken free of his guards. His pistol shook in his hand. "You brought this," he screamed. "You'll burn us all." Before he could fire again, the sheriff tackled him, the gun going off wild into the dirt. The boy pulled his mother back as the flames reached the powder stores. The air trembled. "Get down!" the sheriff roared, and then came the explosion. Deafening, blinding, shaking the ground beneath their feet. The fort's walls blew outward, fire sweeping across the plains. The boy shielded his mother, the force throwing them to the ground. When the dust cleared, everything was chaos. The sky burned orange and black. Horses screamed, men shouted, and somewhere beyond the smoke, the sound of the river rushed like distant thunder. The sheriff staggered to his feet, searching for the boy through the haze. He saw him standing amid the fire, his mother clinging to him, the Apache warriors circling around them like shadows. The boy looked up toward the ridge, where the old chief stood, his face carved in sorrow. The war wasn't over, but in that moment, the boy understood that something far greater than vengeance had been set in motion. The desert had claimed its price, and there would be no turning back. As the fire spread through the fort and into the dry grass beyond, the sheriff's voice broke through the smoke. "Get her out of here," he shouted. "Now!" But the boy didn't move. His eyes were fixed on the horizon, where a second column of riders appeared. Soldiers from the fort's main garrison, charging fast through the valley. The world had turned into flame and dust, and the quiet boy who had once been a shadow now stood between two armies, holding his mother's hand as the desert held its breath one final time, waiting for the storm to break. The air was heavy with smoke and dust as the fire devoured what was left of the fort. The boy stood still in the middle of it, his mother clinging to his arm, her breath ragged but alive. The flames painted the sky a deep orange, and the ground trembled beneath the distant thunder of approaching hooves. The soldiers were coming fast, their banners whipping in the wind, their rifles glinting under the dying sun. Behind the boy, the Apache warriors formed a half circle, ready, silent, their faces streaked with ash and determination. The sheriff limped toward them, his face streaked with soot, his hat long gone. He'd taken a bullet graze to the shoulder, but there was no time for pain. "They won't stop," he said, voice rough. "Not now. You need to get her out before they reach the valley." The boy didn't move. His eyes were fixed on the horizon, on the growing line of soldiers sweeping through the dust. "If I run," he said quietly, "they'll keep hunting her. They'll hunt all of us." The old Apache chief stepped forward, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. "War ends only when both sides are too tired to bury the dead," he said softly. "Your mother's life is not theirs to claim, but yours still belongs to the land." The boy turned to him, unsure what he meant, but there was no time to ask. The first gunshots cracked through the air, sharp and echoing. The Apache warriors answered with arrows and smoke bombs, clouding the field in thick gray haze. The sheriff pulled the boy's mother behind a fallen beam, covering her with his coat. "Stay down," he told her. "Whatever happens, don't move." The boy grabbed his knife, the same one his mother used to use in the kitchen, and looked to the ridge. He saw the soldiers spreading wide, flanking from both sides, but they couldn't see clearly through the smoke. The Apache used it to their advantage, slipping through the haze, silent as shadows, striking and vanishing before the enemy even understood where the attacks came from. The ground shook with the clash of rifles and hooves, men shouting in languages that no longer mattered. In the chaos, the boy and the sheriff found themselves back to back, fighting to keep the flames from spreading toward the prisoners still trapped near the cages. "Get them out," the sheriff shouted. "Forget the fight, save who you can." The boy nodded and ran toward the burning pens, cutting ropes, pulling people free. His mother called after him, her voice breaking, but he didn't turn. Every time he freed another captive, the fire roared closer, the heat pressing against his skin. One man stumbled out coughing, clutching his arm. Another fell to his knees, thanking him through tears. For the first time since he had come back to the town, the boy's silence broke, not with words, but with action that spoke louder than anything he could ever say. By the time the last prisoner was free, the fort was almost gone. The roof collapsed behind them, sending sparks raining into the sky. The Apache warriors were pulling back toward the hills, covering their retreat with smoke and fire. The soldiers tried to pursue, but the canyon walls worked against them, echoing their own confusion. The boy looked back one last time and saw the saloon owner's pistol lying in the dirt, the metal already blackened by the heat. It was over for him. His lies, his greed, his cowardice all turned to ash. As the flames died with the falling night, the survivors gathered by the riverbed, coughing and burned but alive. The boy's mother sat near the water, her hands trembling as she tried to wash the soot from her face. The sheriff knelt beside her, wrapping her in his coat again. "You're safe now," he said quietly, though his voice carried a heaviness that didn't sound sure. The boy stood apart, watching the horizon where the soldiers' campfires flickered faintly in the distance. The battle had ended, but he knew peace hadn't come. Not yet. The Apache warriors had retreated beyond the ridge, and though they had won the day, they would not stay long. The boy understood something that night, that wars didn't end because of victory or defeat, but because people grew tired of hating what they didn't understand. His mother rose and walked to him, placing her hand gently on his arm. "You brought me home," she whispered. "That's all I ever prayed for." He looked at her and finally allowed himself to breathe. "You were never lost," he said softly. "They just forgot who you were." The sheriff joined them, his eyes fixed on the smoke still rising over the fort. "They'll come again," he said. "Men like that always do, but when they do, they'll remember this day. They'll remember what one boy did for his mother, and for a town that didn't deserve him." The boy gave a faint nod. "I'm not fighting for the town," he said. "I'm fighting for what's left of the good in it." The sheriff smiled wearily. "Then maybe that's enough." The days that followed passed quietly. The army never came back for the valley. The fire had burned the fort and the silver mines with it, leaving nothing worth dying over. The town rebuilt slowly, though it would never be the same. The saloon remained empty, its doors swinging in the wind, a reminder of greed and cowardice. The sheriff carried the memory of that night like a scar he couldn't hide. As for the boy and his mother, they stayed in the cabin by the creek. She tended the garden again, though her hands shook when she touched the soil. Sometimes, when the evening light turned the hills gold, she would look out the window and see her son sitting by the water, carving small wooden figures like he used to. Birds, horses, and faces that looked like memories. He still didn't talk much, but his silence no longer frightened the townsfolk. It humbled them. When he walked through the market, people stepped aside, not out of fear but out of respect. Children whispered stories about the day the quiet boy brought 1,000 Apache warriors to save a woman no one else would. And in their stories he became something between a myth and a warning, a reminder that courage doesn't always shout. Sometimes it walks in silence. The old Apache chief returned once before the winter. He came to the cabin alone, carrying a feather tied with leather cord. "For her," he said, handing it to the boy's mother. "For the one who remembered kindness when others forgot." Then he looked at the boy and nodded. "The land knows your name now," he said. "It will speak it long after you're gone." When the spring rains came, they washed away the ashes from the battlefield. The grass grew back over the ruins of the fort, and wildflowers bloomed where fire once burned. Travelers who passed through the valley told stories of strange carvings found along the river, wooden figures of mothers and sons, warriors and doves, each buried in the sand as if someone had left them for the earth to remember. Years later, the sheriff, old and gray, stood on that same ridge where he had first seen the boy ride with the Apache army. The town had changed. The river still ran, quieter now. The cabin still stood, though smoke no longer rose from its chimney. The boy and his mother had gone somewhere south, people said, to the land beyond the desert, where the mountains touched the sky. No one really knew, but sometimes when the wind blew just right, the sheriff swore he could hear the faint sound of hooves in the distance, steady, rhythmic, like a heartbeat across the desert. And he would smile, tip his hat to the horizon and whisper, "You did good, boy. You brought her home." As night fell over the valley, the stars shimmered brighter than ever before. The town slept in peace not because the danger was gone, but because it had learned what true strength looked like, a quiet boy who refused to be forgotten, and a mother who kept hope alive when the world went silent. The desert had taken much, but it had given something back too. It had given them a story that would outlast every storm, every war, every whisper of hatred. A story of love stronger than fear, of silence that spoke louder than guns, and of a boy who reminded them that even in the harshest land, mercy still finds a way to bloom. And as the last wind rolled across the valley, carrying the scent of rain and wild sage, it seemed to say the same words the boy once did, words the desert itself would keep forever. She's home now.